Now let's examine the position of put option seller or writer. So this is the party that has to buy the foreign currency from the put option buyer if the put option buyer chooses to exercise the contract. So we will use the example that we used for the put option seller. So remember that there is a separate video that describes the position of put option buyer. So the example we're using is contract on pounds, so put option contract on pounds. The contract size is 31,250 and the put premium is 15 cents and the exercise price is $1.50. This means that the put option buyer has the right to sell pounds for $1.50 at expiration, but not the obligation to do so. And the put option buyer pays 15 cents per pound to put option seller for this contract. So we said previously that there are three possible scenarios in the future when we discussed the position of put option buyer. So in the future spot rate could be greater than the exercise rate. If that's the case, the put buyer will not exercise this contract as it is not beneficial for the buyer. In the future spot rate could be the same as the exercise rate. In that case, again, the put buyer will not exercise this contract, or if in the future spot rate happens to be less than the than the exercise rate, then the put buyer will exercise this contract and will have positive payoff. So let's then see what the profit is going to be for the seller. But to do so, we have to understand what the profit is going to be for the buyer too. So let's take a look at the position of these two parties when the future spot rate happens to be greater than the exercise rate. If that were the case, as we said, buyer will not exercise, so the buyer's profit or loss is simply the premium that the buyer loses, so it's the negative 15 cents. So the put buyer will not do anything and just lose the premium. On the other hand, seller, right, will just keep the premium. So put option buyer will not exercise the contract, so seller does not have to do anything and just keeps the premium of 15 cents. So the positive, the profit is just simply the premium. So if I were to use a generic notation, it's simply the P. So if in the future spot rate happens to be same as the exercise rate of $1.50, again the buyer will not exercise and simply loses the 15-cent premium that he or she paid for the contract. In other words, they're simply using the losing the premium, and again seller simply keeps the premium of 15 cents, and that's positive P essentially. But if in the future spot rate happens to be less than the exercise rate of $1.50, buyer will exercise this contract and sell pounds at $1.50 instead of the lower spot rate. So if that were the case, the buyer's payoff will be the difference between $1.50 at which they will sell the pounds for according to the put option contract and what the spot rate happens to be at expiration. So let's say spot rate was $1.30. So the payoff is 20 cents per pound, and if we subtract the cost of the contract, the premium, the payoff is then 5 cents per pound for the buyer. If I were to write it in a generic expression for it, it's the difference between the exercise rate and future spot rate minus the premium. So it would be the exact opposite for the seller. The seller will be losing 20 cents per pound when the buyer exercises the contract, but the seller received 15 cents of premium, right, against it, so the total loss is 5 cents. So if I were to write a generic expression for it, it's corrected. It's the difference between exercise rate and this future spot rate minus the premium, and negative sign in front of it because it will be a loss for the seller. So in the future, if future spot rate happens to be $1.30, the buyer will be making 5 cents of profit and the seller will be losing 5 cents of profit. So as you can see, buyers and sellers positions are again exact opposites. So now let's take a look at maximum possible profit for the seller. As you can see, the best case scenario for the seller is if the seller were just to keep the premium. Let's say the buyer does not exercise this contract and seller simply keeps the premium. That's the best possible scenario for the seller. So the most the seller can make is the premium of 15 cents. In other words, the P. Because buyer will exercise this contract only when it's favorable for the buyer to do so. So the best case scenario for seller is if the buyer does not exercise this contract and seller keeps the premium. How about the maximum possible loss? Well, the maximum possible loss is when the future spot rate happens to be as low as possible. So theoretically, that's at the future spot rate of 0. So if that were the case, the seller will be selling pounds for $1.50 by exercising this contract when pounds will be worth essentially nothing. So that's the payoff, positive payoff for this buyer, and when we put negative in front of it, that's the amount of loss for the seller. But of course, seller received 15 cents of premium up front, so let me subtract that from the loss, and maximum possible loss for the seller is $1.35. So in other words, if I were to write a generic expression for it, it's the difference between exercise and the premium. So the most that the seller can lose is $1.35 per pound. So at what future spot rate will the seller break even? In other words, at what future spot rate the loss from buyer exercising the contract is offset by the premium. So we can solve for it. So if I solve for it, essentially what I'm doing is in other words, this is what I'm doing, right? I'm setting the gain from exercising the contract equal to the premium. So when I solve for it, I see that at future spot rate of $1.35, the put buyer will exercise this contract and will have a positive payoff of 15 cents, which means the seller will have a loss of 15 cents, but of course that is offset by the premium of 15 cents, so the seller does not make money or does not lose money. So in the future, if spot rate happens to be the same as exercise rate minus the premium, at that future spot rate, seller will break even, also the buyer will break even too. So let's see what the position of put seller looks like from this graph. So as you can see, lower the future spot rate, more money the put writer loses, and there's a maximum amount to it. In our case, it was $1.35, but after some point, higher the future spot rate, put buyer will not exercise the contract, and the put writer simply keeps the premium, and that's the best possible scenario.